Welcome, everybody. I feel like some of us know each other pretty well already, just from having found the room. Welcome to this evening conference organised by Greenhouse Think Tank. We're focusing on the potentialities for climate activism, which have been created by Extinction Rebellion, over the past few years and the school strikes, but have changed in context since COVID and the war in Ukraine. Rupert Read and John Foster will be putting out, I wouldn't say opposing points on a scale of negative to positive. I got that the wrong way around, didn't I? On a scale of positive, Rupert, to negative, John. And then we'll have Kevin Anderson and Molly Scott-Cato, when she gets here, responding to their points. Without further ado, Rupert.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Obviously, the topic needs a little introduction in terms of importance. I'm just going to say one word of preface about my own capacity to speak to it this evening, which is that I'm not very well. So some of you who may be accustomed to a youthful, vigorous, energetic Rupert will have to put up with something very different this evening. I'm going to be possibly grumpy, certainly relatively brief. I'll try to make every word count, and let's see how we go. So, succinctly, if we look at where we are after COP27, well, it's pretty incredibly grim. So, the one big success of COP27 was the beginning of a loss and damage facility, finally. But given that we probably, if anything, went actually backward on mitigation, i.e. on the fundamental thing that it's all about, the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, does this amount to anything very much more than compensating people for the end of the world? I mean, it's as if the rich countries are saying, well, yeah, actually, we are going to collapse everything, but we'll fob you off with a little bit of money to deal with it as it starts to happen. It's almost as if they're saying, yeah, we're going to hospice civilization. That's about the size of it. Now, that kind of blunt truthfulness, which is the trademark of myself and of John and of Extinction Rebellion and of Greta Thunberg and of Kevin, but not of an awful lot of the mainstream around climate, not of any politician, not of any national leader, not of most scientists, not of most activists, not of most NGOs, not of most campaigners. Well, I think that is now what is required. There's no alternative. But what we're here to talk about partly this evening is what does that imply in terms of what kinds of form action, or more specifically activism, takes in response to this situation? Does it imply that we ought to proceed endlessly further towards the radical flank? What next after Just Stop Oil? Ecotage, perhaps? Then perhaps violence, then perhaps the children of Kali. Those of you who have read Ministry for the Future will be aware of what I'm referring to there. Kim Stanley Robinson's magisterial, wildly over-optimistic novel about the climatic future that awaits us foresees suicide squads of vengeful people from the global south taking out corporate leaders and political leaders who have driven us to the terrible situation that we're in. Those are the children of Kali, a wonderful, horrible idea. Is it inevitable that we go in that direction? Or is there, even now, another possibility? Is it possible that the spirit of truth, that admitting, for example, crucially, that 1.5 is not in practice alive, that even if you were to offer me the most incredible odds, I still wouldn't put a penny on us staying below 1.5 degrees. If we admit things like that, do we have to go ever more towards the radical extreme? Or is it possible that the truth might motivate a much larger group of people, a much larger movement or movement of movements, to step into the space that I believe has been opened up in the last few years by the partial success of the radical flank in 2019. It seems to me that the very best compliment we can pay to the work that myself and others did in Extinction Rebellion and the work that the Youth Climate Strikers did in moving the Overton window and raising climate consciousness permanently and doing something which had basically never been done before, that the very best compliment that can be paid to that partial success is by getting a much larger group of people to move through that Overton window into a space of activism and action. And that's what we're going to need, a much larger phalanx of people. We're going to need millions. I mean, in a country like the UK, several million at least, probably something more like 10 million, people who are willing to actually go further than they've ever gone before in changing their lives and their communities and their workplaces and their businesses and their institutions and ultimately, of course, politics and the very system itself. If we're going to end up anywhere even remotely near to where we need to end up, which is so very far away from where we are at the end of COP27. The COP system is broken. The pitiful pretense that we are still on any kind of pathway whatsoever towards staying below 1.5 degrees or towards net zero 2050 even, for that matter, useless though that is as a target, must be abandoned. What I'm suggesting to you is that that abandonment could be an embrace of the truth, which takes in a far larger number of people than are ever going to be willing to glue themselves to anything or throw soup over something, etc., let alone commit eco-tage or become part of the children of Kali. So, this is the idea which is, as it happens, beautifully timed, launching tomorrow our new moderate flank initiative. So when I say launching tomorrow, from tomorrow you can go, well actually you can go there now, to be honest, but we're not announcing it till tomorrow morning. www.moderateflank.org. The idea is what I've just been starting to describe. What if there is a constituency for, and this is what we're anxious to find out. We don't know for sure, but the signs we've gauged so far seem very good. What if there is a constituency for a message that says, well, maybe you don't have to throw soup at anything or glue yourself to anything, but you certainly have to do a lot more than just up your standing order to Friends of the Earth or whatever. If you're actually serious about helping us build together a world which will be fit for our children and grandchildren, rather than continuing to career down the catastrophic path that we are currently on. What if there is a constituency that are willing to hear and act on that message in numbers by going much further than they have ever gone before, much further than is involved in just upping that standing order a little? Rather doing things perhaps like the people who all around Britain now are setting up climate emergency centres, or who are undertaking community climate action, building local resilience, reaching out to people from across the local community, including perhaps small c, or indeed even large c conservatives, to be a part of that. Or revolutionising things in their workplaces, like professionals, like, for example, the people involved in Lawyers for Net Zero, or the new initiative, which you'll soon be hearing about, Lawyers Are Responsible, which I think is a very interesting, bold initiative you'll be hearing about. It's a clever double meaning if you think about it. Lawyers are responsible. Or people in insurance, or people in business. So one of the things I found very encouraging over the last 18 months, proselytizing for the need for and the emergence of this new moderate flank, is the way that there are actually quite a lot of people in the business world who get it, who are really scared and angry about the inaction of governments, and who want to start to do the multifarious things that businesses need to do if they're to get anywhere near the programme. I talk about everything from changing what your product is to changing what you do with your profits, everything from resilientizing your supply chain to changing completely the way that you use your lobbying power, everything from changing completely the way you use your brand power to thinking about how you can actually directly help your employees or customers or clients to get involved in climate action themselves. This is the broad and diverse distributed set of ideas that are present under the heading of the new moderate flank that we are trying to build, and that, as I say, formally launches tomorrow morning. And, well, in a situation where we frankly don't have many shots, I think it's about the best shot we've got. John has a slightly different view on which you'll hear in a minute, and then we'll hear from our commentators what they think. But that basically is my pitch here this evening, that in this terrible situation, what we need is to be frank about how terrible the situation is, and to use that as a basis for mobilizing a far larger number of people than have so far been mobilized. When we admit that 1.5 is gone, for example, then the terrible climate injustice can be stared in the face rather than put off. Those well-meaning activists who are going around now saying we've got to keep 1.5 alive, they're saying the same thing as John Kerry is saying and Alok Sharma is saying. It's all just an excuse for pretending that the show is on the road for another year. Sooner or later, the buck has to stop somewhere. So, a truth-based movement that obviously needs to provide mutual support and resilience of a psychological nature for people to cope with that truth, and realistic, possible, attractive, positive invitations to agency and action. And then a sense covering all of this, that this is starting to happen and that it could happen a lot more, and wouldn't it be great to be a part of it? These are the pillars of the new moderate flank that we're seeking to build. And if you leave here this evening convinced that this is about our best shot, then please get involved. Thank you.
Thank you. So, John, is that realistic?
Right, okay, well, thank you, Zoe. Just before I don my speaker's hat, perhaps with my greenhouse organiser's hat on, I'd like to second the welcome that you've had from the chair, from Baroness Jones, and also to apologise for anybody who was incommoded by confusion about getting into this place, which is rather more like Hogwarts than I'd imagined. It was down to information we had from this end, but never mind. Greenhouse, which is running this, was founded in 2011 by Rupert to lead the development of green thinking in the UK, but he's still associated and I've been associated with it for a while. And from what I have to say, you'll see how widely and creatively diverse the greenhouse banner actually is. So I agree entirely with Rupert that confronting the climate crisis now has to be taken in hand by civil society rather than being left to the conventional political system. It is slightly ironic to be saying that on the parliamentary estate perhaps, but perhaps not. Attempting to get the crisis faced up to by conventional politicians, let's be honest, has failed worldwide. Indeed, as painfully exhibited at the recent COP, the commitment of conventional politics is going backwards, albeit with the war in Ukraine as a convenient excuse. All honour to truly green politicians across the world, including those in both houses of Parliament and the devolved assemblies here in the UK, but their progress towards constituting any sort of majority anywhere by regular electoral means can't any longer even be called glacially slow, because it's increasingly being left behind by the rate at which the glaciers are melting. If we do focus on the UK, well, you know, Liz Truss's growth mantra might just be dismissed as echoes in an empty head. But Sunak seems to be offering us essentially the same thing, only with added fiscal sadomasochism. And the only democratically possible alternative is a centrist Labour government. Yet, although Starmer, to his credit, or perhaps to Ed Miliband's credit, now talks about a fairer and greener society, he too bangs on interminably about growth. And anybody who takes the climate emergency seriously knows that further economic growth is just incompatible with a society which has any hope of becoming greener enough to prevent now inevitable disasters from accumulating into final catastrophe. So civil society, in response to this gross dereliction of political duty, has stepped up, and so it will step up further. We should take the Braverman Public Order Bill as recognition of XR's success and that of cognate movements, not any kind of setback. Mobilising and focusing large-scale civil disobedience was all along strategically conceived as attempting to promote either concession or repression. Well, concession came first, but was largely tokenistic. A more widespread parroting of the phrase climate emergency, but mostly just as a phrase. And now, unsurprisingly, as climate breakdown worsens and actions ramp up, we're getting repression. The idea always was that in a society without a tradition of political repression, or perhaps I should say without a recent tradition of political repression, this will generate a surge of wider support as ordinary decent folks at large recognise that this isn't an issue which can be dealt with by policemen, by, as it were, banging up the anxiously non-violent from teenagers to grannies from 6 months to 10 years. This sort of tectonic shift in mainstream consciousness that Rupert posits is all part of the continuing achievement of the new normal. But I'm unpersuaded by the model that I take him to be advocating of how this shift acquires political leverage. Because on his model, as I understand it, responsible moderate activism needs to move people in massive numbers to reject climate responsibility. Essentially, it needs to mobilise most of this shifted mainstream to provoke a widely popular movement, evolving perhaps into a popular uprising as it meets increasing resistance. I doubt that's plausible. How plausible it is I think something we should try and get our heads around tonight. I'm going to suggest 2 reasons why it might not be, both of which are unmentionable in polite political discourse, but I'm going to be rude enough to mention them. The first is that those by whom any climate emergency is effectively recognisable during the remaining time we have, which I take to be sort of 2 decades at the very most, must, in the nature of the kind of emergency it is, be a minority. That is because they must unite virtues not widely co-present. They must be intelligent enough to understand the issues and the upshots of the science. They must be imaginative enough to make the consequences, particularly the longer-term consequences, vivid to their minds. They must be reflective enough to appreciate the implications of all this for the meaningfulness of their own lives and activities. And then they've got to be honest enough not to lie about this to other people or much more demandingly to themselves. And they've got to be brave enough to act against collective apathy and deep institutional disincentives. Now, persons combining all these virtues, although of course all of us here present, I assume, do so, will always be a small minority of any population. And the majority population, this is my second unmentionable, to whom the minority might in modesty look for legitimation, are now addicted to the consumerism which is driving climate disaster. I mean, one might just point to the Gadarene rush post-COVID back to the airports, but there are plenty of other plenty of other kinds of evidence. I mean, I know all about surveys that say 66% of the population support non-violent climate activism to confront the climate emergency. And you read that in The Guardian, and then you wake up and you see what they're doing in the rest of their lives. Addiction in this context is not just a metaphor for the way in which our economic and social institutions are set up to promote consumerism. Rather, it points to a combination of those undoubted forces with much deeper cultural and existential factors which are working to produce a condition in the majority of consumers which exhibits significant characteristics of actually genuinely pathological addiction, including failure of the supposed satisfiers, the commodities, to do anything but increase the craving, inability of the sufferers to break free by their own volition, however much they may accept in principle, on paper, in answering surveys, the need to do so. And if that's the case, individual inability to forego attachment to commodity-driven lifestyles is going to seriously impede the necessary changes, and attempts by governments under moderate flank pressure to promote such changes may well encounter the kind of resistance which we've already seen in France with the Gilets jaunes, there being nothing that fires up an addict quite so much as a threat to the security of their supply. The crunch question to which all this leads us, in my view, is how can the conscious and responsible minority organise itself to take power in the time now left? Because that's crucially what it's about, taking power. If that sounds Leninist, good, because it's meant to. How could such a seizure of power actually happen? Well, that, I suggest, is the real challenge which the climate-conscious minority, represented by us here in this room, must now very urgently and totally unsentimentally try and get to grips with. It's our tragic responsibility at this tragic juncture. And it's a process in which a serious Green Party ought to be giving a lead. Here are some pointers, and at the moment they can be nothing more. We're a functionally crucial minority, coming from the ranks of lawyers, the people Rupert was listing, administrators, managers, serving officers, scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, educators, students, caring professionals, even some currently elected representatives, although in virtue of their responsible rather than their elected representativeness. I mean, we might also just note that it includes the current constitutional head of the state. An across-the-board climate strike, following the inspiring and shaming example of the school strikers, by all or most of this potential cohort, we might let the king off, but, you know, pretty well everybody else, properly coordinated and actively pursued, for a fortnight, would bring the fossil fuel state, would stop it in its tracks anyway, bring it to its knees. It would need to be continued, and organised such pressure would need to continue for a while to bring it to its knees. But in the volatile situation thus ensuing, could there not be an opening for some alternative governing consensus to emerge? Now, of course, the first reaction to that will be that's completely far-fetched. But is it any more so than the hope that continuing with present political arrangements could save us? That seems to be the crunch question. No one's talking about what is and what isn't far-fetched. A slogan for the new normal, which appears in the title of this evening's event, might be, old realities are no longer realistic, old extremities are no longer extreme. We've surely reached the point at which conventional political means can no longer be the default reference point by which radical alternatives are dismissed as far-fetched, unrealistic, or even insane. I mean, just remember that definition of insanity that says it's about keeping on doing the same thing and expecting different results. So my book, Realism and the Climate Crisis, of which there's a display copy cunningly placed behind the wine. I can't sell copies, I'm told, on these august precincts, but there are flyers for discount purchase if anybody's interested. My book argues that the principal role of climate activists now should be to bring such an organised, conscious minority of the responsible into being. It doesn't happen by itself. It's not constructed, as it were, by class relations or economic forces. It has to be brought into being. And it needs led by a vanguard group. Now, I hope some people will want to take up these ideas in the discussion, and I will conclude. I've got time to conclude.
You have indeed got time to conclude.
I will conclude with 3 questions which they might wish to pursue with some suggested answers. So the first question is this proposal undemocratic? Yes. But the tele-democratic travesty which can empower a Trump and a Johnson is surely terminally broken. And for the deep cultural reasons which have also produced commodity addiction, it's now all we've got. Proper democracy is an ideal to return to if we come through, but it shouldn't be made into a shibboleth to prevent us from doing whatever is needed to get through. James Lovelock, bless his soul, was right. Democracy might need to be put on hold. Is it fascist? No, that's just a stupid polemic smear. Although a new governing consensus might initially have to be firmly authoritarian, not the same thing. This is, of course, very uncomfortable for people who come to these thoughts, this exigency, from liberal enlightenment habits and expectations. But who promised that any of this was going to be comfortable? And finally, is it elitist? Yes, that's its whole point. Emboldening a vanguard elite rather than mobilising another flank is, I would suggest, how we should think of best exploiting the way that a new normal has been achieved for us by the activism of the last 3 or 4 years. We, who know what is coming, can no longer be content to advise and warn, nor even to protest and agitate. We must work to reconceptualise our responsibility and then organise to take charge before it is irretrievably too late. Thank you.
Thank you. Kevin, I'm going to go to you first. I was uncertain where their crucial point of difference was going to come. I didn't realise it was going to be democracy or not democracy. Would you like to respond?
Yeah, well, I'll do my best. How long do we have to respond?
10 minutes.
Oh, crikey, as long as that.
Well, you can do 5 minutes.
No, that's fine. No, I'm quite good at rambling on. Overall, I was much more convinced by Rupert's arguments. But I'm not certain part of that is because I was just very uncomfortable with some of John's, and he pointed out at the end, he said he's elitist. And yesterday, I was out for a cycle ride, and on the way home, I cycled during the time when kids leave schools, independent schools, so I was coming back to Alderley Edge, which is a place I'd always widely avoid at all costs, Alderley Edge in Wilmslow. It's where all the footballers and the and professors live. And so I was cycling back through there, and I could see all these people you were talking about, all these elites, getting into their massive four-wheel drives and picking up their Charlottes and Tarquins from the local schools. If you're looking for them to join this elitist group, I think you'll be waiting a long time. So I'm slightly more attracted by Rupert's idea here of a wider constituency of people, not this elite group. To me, this elite group have been actually part of the problem. And I think that's, I'll come back to that in a second, but I think that's probably why we haven't responded to climate change, because we've developed a universal we, rather than actually separating that we out. There is no universal we on climate change, either on mitigation or on adaptation. There's a small group of this elite who are responsible for the lion's share of the emissions, and we have no intention of changing our consumption patterns at all at the moment. And there's another we who aren't responsible for any of those emissions, that some of them in the UK, but mostly elsewhere in the world, who are being stuffed by the impacts of climate change. So we think we can, the we rich ones causing the problem, think we can with our finance and geographically, insulate ourselves from the impacts of climate change. So I'm not won over by appealing to that same group that have deliberately undermined, through forms of what some people call soft denial, I call it mitigation denial, denied the need for major, radical, deep social change. Relying on them, I think, would be a mistake. I don't know my history that well, but this seems to me almost a period when it's a little bit like the start of the Labour Party, when we need to be calling other people who are not the causes of this problem in our own country. Most people in this country, the mean income in this country, household income, is £37,000. The median, if you lined everyone up, every household, 28 million households, took one out in the middle, is £31,000. And the most typical income for a household in the UK, these are household incomes, remember, is £23,000.
Wow.
Yeah. This is one of the richest countries in the world. Remember where a young child died last week because of mould in their house. And they didn't die last week, but the coroner's report was last week. So I don't think I'm looking to the elites, to the professors, to the barristers, to the journalists, to the rest of us in these places to bring about this change. Yes, we should be part of it, but if we're going to be the ones that are driving this agenda, heaven help us, in my view. So I don't know where the response will come from. I'm really impressed by what's happened in civil society in the last 5 years. It's the only area of climate change that's given me any significant hope in the last 5 years, is to see those voices emerging, and they haven't been all unified. They've done things in very different ways, and I'm very much of the view that change will come, if it is going to come at all. Well, it will become, either because forced by climate change or we do something more constructive about it. It will come out of some sort of much more sort of emergent mess of people doing their different things. So it may well be the moderate flank, together with people throwing soup, other people stick themselves to wherever they stick themselves to. And it may well indeed be some of John's elitist cadre there. They might well be part of this. But I think it to assume that it will be an elite group that drive us forward to some sort of future, I think is in my view, I see it as quite dangerous. And on the democracy side, actually, I slightly disagree with John there. I think it's actually more democratic doing something about climate change, because what we've realised in modern times is that our national boundaries are no longer appropriate for democracy. What we do has massive impacts elsewhere in the world. And so if those impacts aren't embedded in the democratic process, then that's anti-democratic. So when we make changes and do things in our country that are to take into account of views elsewhere in the world, not wanting to be impacted by our climate change that we're imposing on them, to me that's more democratic, not less democratic. So I think we need to question what we mean by democracy in a world where actually we're much more aware that the system boundaries are much wider than we thought before. I disagreed a little bit with Rupert on the 1.5, and this is something I've given a lot of thought to, and I'm working with a colleague on this. And I don't really want to get into all the details of this, because there's some numbers and stuff behind it all, but broadly, and I don't think there's any chance we haven't got a good chance of 1.5. We haven't got even a 50-50 chance, but there's an outside chance. If we're lucky on the science, in terms of our understanding of the science, then the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they give us enough emission space to give us a sort of 1 in 6, 1 in 10 type chance of staying below 1.5. And to reject that is the same thing as rejecting staying well below 2 degrees centigrade, because that's roughly the same sort of budget, the same amount of carbon dioxide emissions we can put in the atmosphere. And if you drew a curve from that, even if we do nothing, like the COPs at the moment, which do nothing about climate change, in fact they go backwards, I don't think loss and damage was actually a positive move, because we decided to impose more loss and damage at that COP. So we had an agreement on loss and damage, but we also agreed to apply more loss and damage. So overall, it was a regressive step, not a positive step, even on the loss and damage. So at every single level, COP27 went backwards. Remember, every year it's about 40 billion tonnes of CO2 in the atmosphere. But for an outside chance of 1.5, even if the COPs carried on failing for the next 3, 4, 5 years, and then we somehow had some revelation and we suddenly decided we're going to do something about climate change, you would still have roughly, if you then start to come down an emissions line, to something like 2060-ish to get zero emissions, to give us an outside chance of 1.5, but more likely 2 degrees centigrade. But also, of course, because it's all about probabilities, not an insignificant chance we can still hit 3. I mean, you have to remember this. When we say it's a good chance of 1.5, that's still an outside chance of 3. So we have to think about and understand it's the risk and consequences issue here. And my concern about closing that debate down at 1.5 is that we haven't yet, in any of the analysis we've done, really thought about major social change. That's not embedded in any of our scenarios. None of us in those scenarios think about actually rationing on the basis of need and sufficiency rather than just on the basis of price. We're still building large houses. Why are we building any houses over 150 metres, over 100 metres squared? Why do we make sure that next house that is sold that's over 100 metres squared is broken up into 1, 2 or 3 houses? So we haven't got to build lots more, which saves us on materials, which we can then use for public transport. So we're going to have to use our resources in a much, much different way than what we are today. So it is like a Marshall Plan for 2022, like the rebuilding of continental Europe after it was blown up. That's the sort of change that we're talking about. Completely radical shifts. No one would be on high income having luxurious lifestyles in this. I think Monbiot's phrase of private sufficiency and public luxury, and actually I think that also plays, or was an argument against some of John's view there, because I think that does give scope for getting more people on board. Most of my friends happen to be didn't go to university because I've got a non-university background before going to academia. Most of my friends have never had a fancy education of any sort, and I don't understand them I don't see them in the way you describe this other group out there. They're not like that. I think if they like to live reasonable lives, have reasonable houses, be able to afford the heating, go down to the pub with their friends, do their activities. In my case, I cycle and rock climb with them. They want those sorts of things and some security in that. They're not all aspiring to huge levels of consumption. So I do not recognise this hoi polloi out there that you're sort of evoking. I have much more time for them being brought over by a sort of an FDR honesty, Roosevelt's honesty with his fireside chats, literally then 4 elections on. He didn't do any focus groups or any other crap like that. He had a vision for the future and he sold it to people in the States at a very, very difficult time and won, I think it was 4 elections he won. I think that's the vision we're talking about, not one that's going to be propagated by a handful of elites who, in my view, have actually let us down anyway.
I mean, because you've got 1 minute left, can I just ask a follow-up? Which is that you're talking apples and pears here. You're talking about a financial elite, and you were talking about an intellectual elite.
Same thing.
And you're saying those are the same
Oh,
thing?
God, professors, £70,000 minimum. How much your barristers on? How about the solicitors? How about some of the journalists? I mean, there are people out there. I mean, as I said, the household income, household income is £23,000. £23,000.
I know, but that would be you could find 2 PhD students with that as their household.
Yeah, but there won't be. PhD students are not aspiring to that.
I know they're not aspiring to it, but I'm saying to you, if you're talking on the one hand about only intellectual elites being able to fight climate change, and on the other hand about financial elites being responsible for climate change, you're going to end up at cross purposes. No,
firstly, I think the PhD one I would disagree with. PhD is on 17,000, 2 of them in a house is 34,000. That takes them above the median.
It puts them in penury. Probably.
I know, I would agree, but they're not aspiring to that. It's not what they're going to live for their lives. They know they're doing that, and actually they probably came from a wealthy background on average. I spend my time in universities and see who do the PhDs. So I'm not, I was quite careful with my language. I'm all for some of these elites coming along, but the idea of relying on the elites, to me, is incredibly dangerous. And I do not see, quite clearly do not see a separation between these financial elites and these other sort of power elites. You see, I see those things as deeply embedded, and we've tried to pretend that we're not part of that group for a long time because it helps our conscience. Yeah. I'm part of that financial and power elite, and I don't find it comfortable.
Okay. In that case, Molly, would you like to respond? And then we'll... Sorry, you haven't been introduced to Molly Scott-Cato. This is the fabulous Molly Scott-Cato, who was the MEP, who was the Green MEP, should have been an MP in my view, which is a very un-Labour thing to say. But anyway, it's all yours.
Thank you for a kind introduction. 2 bits of throat clearing. Firstly, I'm a professor and I don't earn 70,000, but I nearly do. So I should complain. I should complain.
Go part-time.
And secondly, 5 of us founded Greenhouse, and I was one of those people, and I was the only one that wanted to say that. I did that with Rupert. Right, so I've got a few responses to what was actually proposed, and then 3 points of my own, and I shall try and whip through this quite quickly, because obviously you want to get in, and I'd like to hear what you have to say. So one of the questions I think that was raised is, has the Overton window shifted? And I think it's unquestionable that it has shifted, and this has been the major achievement of the street actions in favour of serious climate action. I think that's an amazing achievement. We're in a totally different place now. However much people get pissed off about other people sitting on gantries or stuck to things, everybody has realised this is a crisis. You know, you're in your hairdresser and people are talking about it, you're in a taxi, everybody's realised, and that is a significant achievement from the movement that Rupert was involved with. And I actually helped, we launched together, didn't we, just out there a few years ago. But I think that's banked now, and I think this movement, I think maybe this is where I agree with you, Rupert, I don't think that movement is achieving much now, because it's put that on the agenda, it's completely upped the ante in terms of what we have to do. But where it failed, it was never attached to a political lever, and it never had a convincing theory of change. And I've debated this with Bradbrook and with Roger Hallam and various platforms, and they just avoid the question. Were you sitting on the street there? Where was the connection between that and somebody who could make political change? It was never there, and I'm sorry to say I don't think that was sufficiently thought through. And lastly, I think what we're failing to do, and what we've failed to do for a long time, is take the vested interests seriously. We shouldn't be campaigning against citizens or telling citizens to change what they're doing. We should go for the targets, the bastards who are profiting from this chaos and have no intention of changing. Yeah. And they're not open to sweet reason, and they should be, I'm getting quite warmed up already. They should be our target. And I think we all know who I'm talking about here. Because there are a lot of people who are powerful and who do have attachments to those levers of power, and they want things to carry on the same because they're making a lot of money out of this system, and it makes them rich and it makes them powerful. Right, my 3 points. First point, I get so annoyed whenever people talk about space exploration. And I know this is a sort of Marmite thing, because lots of people get thrilled by it, and you hear them all getting excited on the Today programme. And I just find it infuriating, because I want to say, don't go to another planet until you've learned how not to screw up this one. Right? I see some people in the room are with me. I'm sure other people aren't with me. But anyway, regardless of what I think about that, what we have to do is create a similar level of enthusiasm for what we're proposing to people who are proposing forward to Mars. Forward to Mars is a significant bit of psychological denialism, right? It's saying, well, we don't, in some level, people are thinking, we don't really need to worry about the tremendous mess we're causing here, because somewhere out there there's a wonderful planet we'll get to. We all know you can't live on Mars, you can't live on the moon, it's nonsense. But at the same time, it's a sort of nonsense that keeps people away from the freaking out we all do. And they have to be doing that freaking out in order to bring about the change. So anyway, that's not really the point. The point is, how do we generate that level of enthusiasm for the world we're trying to create? I'm afraid to say I don't think moderate flank is going to do that. I don't think centrism is going to do that. I haven't got an answer to what will do that, but I think that's what we have to try to do. I believe this world that is a sustainable world that will address the climate crisis is a far better world than we live in now. It's a world of justice, equality, a lot more time with your family in the countryside and so on. But we're not successfully creating enthusiasm for that. We're focusing on the chaos and disaster, not focusing enough on the vision. So we have to build that movement for positive change to build that future. The second thing is, and I don't normally say this, but I think I'm sort of a born-again, lifestyle person in a way, and that's because I had a heat pump fitted in February, and it's completely transformed my house and my life and everything else. And it's also turned on the day Putin went into Ukraine, so I've got a sticker on it saying, "This machine kills fascists," which amuses me every time I see it. But the point about that is, it took me a long time to do that. A lot of Greens I know still don't have a heat pump. Why is that? One reason is it costs £12,000, and this relates to the point about elites, right? Because obviously we say you should get one of those fitted at public expense. But still, there's a lot of people with £12,000 in the bank that haven't done that. And to me, this sort of change is very important, and we haven't. We really don't. I'm enthusiastic about it. I drag people into my house to look at it. But there's so much nonsense, just as well you don't live in my street. There's so much nonsense talked about this. So there's all sorts of stuff on the internet, no doubt put around by the fossil fuel industry, telling you how it doesn't work. I have arguments with people all the time, you have to change all your radiators. you know, I mean, I don't know how many people in this room are also born again heat pump people, but it's all nonsense. It's very easy to do. Okay, you need £12,000, but But I'll get that all back from the renewable heat incentive. So it's an absolute no-brainer. You can't because that's ended now. But but what I found is not only did I have to believe my builder against a huge amount of bullshit that's talked about heat pumps, but I also had to overcome psychological resistance. And that was really hard, and I've been a Green for a long time, and I had to sort of take this leap of faith, and I think we should really support people much better in doing that. And one idea we could all do in our communities is what we have in Stroud. It's called Green Doors, because we have a thing called Open Studios. It's sort of an arty place, and everybody's really nosy. So you pretend you're going to look at people's art, but really you're snooping at their house. Anyway, we're going to have we have that also for people who've had retrofitting done, basically. So you can go and actually see. You can be talked to by people like me who are so enthusiastic about heat pumps, and you know it overcomes your sort of psychological barriers. If you don't have that in your community, I would suggest that's one thing you could usefully do in the spring. And the third point is the kind of most aggressive point in a way, and that's about fighting fossil fuels. Why don't we do that a lot earlier? I really still don't understand why we didn't say, this is the end of fossil fuels and we're going to take them head on. I can remember when I was elected as an MEP, which was 2014, I still wasn't thinking seriously about the end of fossil fuels. So it must have been 2015 or something like that, when I, as a serious long-term greenie, realised that. And even now I see people going on about meat and other stuff, and you know, these are distractions. We just need to go for fossil fuels and the people that fund fossil fuels. That should be our one focus. Because it's still quite new for most people to realise that. Why are you buying that car? Because you know those cars are going to be phased out. We're moving beyond fossil fuels. Every time you say that to people, you're really shifting them on. That is the most important message. And also because they're fighting back. They're really fighting back and trying to keep the world... For some reason, they don't care about the chaos and disaster. They're just caring about the profits. And so we need specific targets, like no fossil fuel lobbyists in any COP, for example. You know, the things we need to campaign for need to be seriously focused on fossil fuels and getting them out of this Parliament, or no fossil fuel lobbyists at Westminster, no fossil fuel lobbyists in the Westminster Parliament, and so on. A number of targets. And keep challenging when we hear bullshit from them on the radio or, you know, in the media. Not just climate change denialism, but climate change delayism and pro-fossil fuel. We just need to go for that, in my view. Let's not waste our time on all the peripheral issues, because in the end it all comes back to fossil fuels. So let's go for that.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to go to questions, and do put questions in, otherwise I'll just monopolise. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thank you. So really a very, very quick question to Amy Rupert, but really appreciating the other provocations. So I really see on the broad coalition the thing about the excitement of moving over to civil society and working out how you connect to social justice so that you don't have those rearguard movements when a carer hears that their diesel car's being taken away from them and wants to go campaign against net zero. And I think it's really important to do the involvement side if you don't have a political arm, plus also the excitement of making it kind of completely taboo to have a pension that invests in fossil fuels and look at positive things for people to invest in. However, there is a huge category of the world where fossil fuels are linked to political power and dictatorship and quasi-dictatorship. And I think there's a slightly more vexed issue there about how, with your Bolsonaros, your Putins, how you create an international order which acknowledges even if you have two power blocks, you're going to have one atmosphere. So you need solving at that level as well, and the kind of more oppositional in terms of what's the politics that defeats that machismo, death-loving sort of world, and also what's the international order that needs to grow to sort of push that out of the way over time.
Look, I don't claim that the prescription that I outlined here is the answer to our problems everywhere and to 100%. It's more like in countries like this one, something like this strategy seems to me the best that we've got. I think it's especially so in countries, obviously, where there's... It's not going to be nearly so relevant in countries where it's really hard to do any organising. or as you say, perhaps also in countries which are sort of more definitively polarized than we are, maybe, like Brazil. But I think it is crucial in this country and countries like this one, countries where we did benefit from the massive civil society breakthrough in 2019, and where there is some degree of scope for democratic organising, and where there is polarisation, but it's not really extreme. On polarisation, by the way, this is another freestanding, if you will, really important argument in favour of the moderate flank strategy, that one of the downsides of the radical flank success in the last few years is it has contributed to polarisation. I mean, we knew this when we started Extinction Rebellion. We deliberately set out to force some conversations and to do that partly by polarising. But that has a real cost. And my view is that it is essential that unpolarizing, anti-polarizing be a key part of what happens next, because climate, unlike issues such as nuclear weapons or ozone-depleting substances, is not a question that you can resolve without getting the vast majority of society onto your side, because it inflects and affects pretty much everything that pretty much all of us do pretty much all the time. So that's another reason for thinking that we need to have a mass moderate flank, and that we need to have a movement that is deliberately unpolarizing. And that's what we would seek to do. And that's one of the reasons why I think that my strategy is rather more realistic than John's.
I like the way you bridged that, though. It's like, how do we deal with this internationally? Oh, well, we go to my moderate flank strategy.
Well, I think that's what I was being asked,
You're
right?
turning into a real politician.
No, I think that's what I was being asked. I can check. I'm happy to check with Will.
Yeah,
I thought what you were asking was, is the moderate flank strategy relevant everywhere in the world?
Just on top of that, there is I really buy the moderate flank domestically, but what's the international response to it?
Well, so just a little bit more on that then. So we're liaising with people who are doing things that are somewhat similar in Germany, in Canada,
right,
in Australia. I think this could be a truly international phenomenon. I don't know whether it can be a global phenomenon, but to be honest, that's above my pay grade. I'm happy if it's truly international. In relation to France, by the way, one specific point on France, I think what John said about the Gilets jaunes is quite unfair, and I would be more with Kevin on this, that the Gilets jaunes were responding to a regressive carbon tax, and that's part of the point, right, that this thing has to be joined up. And actually, if you read the Gilets jaunes final statement a year later, they specifically say what we want is a way that the struggle facing those who worry about the end of the week and those who worry about the end of the month and those who worry about the end of the world can all be united.
Yeah. I'm going to go to Molly for an answer to that. Before that, I'm going to say, anybody, because we're quite a small group and we all seem quite nice, if you want to get a drink while we're talking, do go ahead. Don't feel too polite. Molly, then you.
Okay. Yeah. I wanted to take your geopolitical question head on because I think it's absolutely crucial, because the end game here is countries that are profiting from the fossil fuel economy versus countries that are prepared to move beyond the fossil fuel economy, right? And it's no coincidence, because of the resource curse, that the countries that profit from fossil fuels are the petrostates, really, are largely authoritarian states, whether we think about Venezuela or Saudi or Russia or wherever. So in a way, we're being forced into that new world order. This is why I think it's dangerous to go down John's route, because I think, what have we got to offer there? We are the successful democratic states, right? And so if we abandon that, then what have we got to show that we're better than the authoritarian states? But I would say one sort of straw in the wind in terms of what you're talking about is the EU carbon border adjustment policy, which I started the ball rolling with others when I was an MEP. And the purpose of that is to say, if you're not meeting climate standards when you produce goods, we won't have those goods in our market, or if we do, we'll charge a tax on them that reflects the difference. And I think, if states are not dealing with climate change at all, then we don't trade with them at all. If they're not doing enough, then we charge tariffs and so on. I think we're sort of seeing the start of that now, and I think that's pointing in the direction you're talking about.
Okay. I'm going to take your question in a minute because John wants to come back and so does Kevin. Is that right?
I've got various things I could say.
You don't have to. Kevin, you wanted
Just
to
on
come
the,
back
on the
to-
global one, I don't think we use fossil fuels for economic reasons. I don't think we have done for a long time. We use them for power reasons, and we're locked in, cultural lock-in of particular groups. Renewables are already cheaper on both a capital cost point of view, building them. So you compare building wind turbines, even solar panels, per kilowatt compared with even a gas-fired power station, let alone a gas-fired power station with some nonsense carbon capture and storage thing on it. That's a lot more expensive. And the operating costs are far more expensive for fossil fuels, even when economists or astrologers, as I prefer to call them, and put a discount rate on them. So both operationally and from a build point of view, renewables are far cheaper, even when you take account of some of the infrastructure issues. So I think, to me, I'm not worried about about Russia and these other so-called authoritarian states, well, definitely authoritarian states out there. I think if it was evident that other parts, significant economic blocs, had shifted away from fossil fuels for good financial reasons, if you like, then that would be quite quickly percolate to them. So why the hell are we doing this? I mean, it's expensive to do. It costs us. It's not good for our health. There's a lot of volatility in terms of prices and so forth. So there's not much in favour of fossil fuels. Once we demonstrate, which we should have done more already, demonstrate how cheap and reliable a renewable set of options could be. And one other thing, just to say, it's not just the authoritarian states that are in favour of fossil fuels. I mean, the US, the biggest producer of fossil fuels now, bigger than Saudi, Norway, the UK, Australia. Anyone who's got them is trying to pursue them, regardless of their democratic structures, one way or another.
Okay. I'll take your question now, even though I promised it ages ago.
Yeah, first thing is I'm really surprised at what you say. The Leninist bureaucracy. I can't get over that, really. But really, I'm really interested in what Rupert said, because he used the C word. He's conservative. And as a conservative myself, I'm really reluctant to speak in this forum. But I think, I'm truly reluctant. I'm sure I'm not in the majority here. Just a social conservative, not a big C conservative, just a social conservative, which is like the vast majority of our population.
Yeah.
The working class, the Brexit class, all the rest of it. We've got a real problem here if you want to get to them, don't you? That's what you're saying. You want to get to them. Well, surely there's something that conservatives can contribute here in terms of like a personal responsibility. I'll just give you an example. About 10 years ago, I took an allotment, quite a big allotment, and I tried to be kind of a bit green, a bit lefty, and all my vegetables died, right? So what I decided to do, was grow insects on it instead, and it's been really successful, and it's spread across our allotment. And that's maybe that's the kind of thing, a very, very down-to-earth conservative idea that maybe you could take up. I've written a bit about it, and it seems to be quite. It's not a big idea like all your big ideas. It's fine, but it's something I think which is doable. And it's a conservative thing.
Could I?
So, yeah, of course.
Yeah, my experience in the House of Lords is that the Conservatives there care very much about green stuff. And there are times when they make speeches that I could have made myself. And they're very good when it comes to insects or ducks or ponds. I don't know if you know Matt Wrigley, who's a very big climate denier.
Yeah.
He's got a 50-acre wildflower meadow on his land and a lake that he conserves and so on. Conservatives can offer huge information and ideas to us. So it's not just they bring lefties.
Yeah, but I'm really concerned about
they don't extrapolate. And so they're absolutely blind to the fact that their consumption has a bad effect on the rest of the world and on us.
Yeah, but you're talking about large C conservatives here, which I would imagine a large element of their beliefs are free market neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not talking about people like that. I'm talking about people like me. And the people on our allotments who want to grow their vegetables, they want to do that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're killing all these insects.
Yeah. Okay, John, I'm going to put a pin in you for a second and take this question, and then you can take You can take insects and anything else.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of respond to one of John's comments about the merits of authoritarianism. And I mean, really, if you think about the kind of authoritarian governments around the world, Xi Jinping's, Modi's, they're just as much obsessed with the kind of the growth paradigm as anybody else. I mean, there's no kind of, I mean, if you're looking for a sort of a somewhat good news story, I'd say maybe Singapore might be one, but it's not exactly immune from this kind of response. I think the real issue is really, it's really how you reweight democracy, rather than just sort of take it as it is now. If you think about what the kind of impediments are to democracy now, I mean, Molly, on your side, I mean, the reason why people aren't investing in heat pumps in my neck of the woods is that, essentially a lot of older people care a lot about the land value and the price of their houses, through the kind of conservation area committees and stuff like this prevents it. And if you think about a lot of kind of American democracy, it's essentially been brought up by oil interests. And in fact, the last time I was in this building was part of the oil lobby, where the gas industry is trying to reinvent itself as a hydrogen economy now, and that's kind of a big push there. So why don't we just think about how we actually weight the political impact? Maybe give proportionally far more votes to people who've got greater life expectancy. People who are actually younger now, and at the moment far too much political clout is for older, property-owning people who are opposed to onshore wind. That's why it's a bit off the political spectrum now.
So can I just distill that? You're against authoritarianism, but you want to give young people more weight at the ballot box than old people.
Re-weight.
I mean, it's bold.
Well, to redress the way we essentially give too much political power to the wealthy at the moment.
It's not that new. I mean, John Stuart Mill proposed a democratic system in which people had weighted votes back in 1860-something, so this is not...
And the biggest kind of issue is really that the decision about who becomes American president is probably far more important for most people in the world than who their own leader is quite often.
Yeah.
So do we get a vote there in your world?
Well, this comes back to Kevin. This comes back to Kevin's point that we can say democracy, fighting climate change is democratic because the impacts reach beyond our borders, but we can't escape the fact that we only have democratic agency within our borders. I mean, we don't have democratic agency in America, and we don't have democratic legitimacy in Kenya. So,
do we know though? Isn't that partly what these? Isn't it that you get an international negotiation, and then the different, let's say, with the word democracies and others come along, authoritarian organisations come along with their particular national stance, however they interpret it. And then there's some agreement. And then if there was an agreement that then you went back to your country to do your bit in line with that agreement, then that would in a sense be taking account of the democracy of other countries. Okay. But that's not what we do. Unfortunately, the cops don't deliver on that at all.
Anyway, sorry, I completely derailed that. You were asking a question and you were just about to answer it.
Well, I'm not sure I was... perhaps this will answer it if I also respond to Kevin's point about elites. I mean, if you're picking up Tarquin in your SUV and you're happy about it, you're not part of the minority I'm envisaging. If you're picking up Tarquin in your SUV and you're starting to worry about it, then you might be moving in that direction. And the people who are, as it were, worrying about those aspects of their lifestyles and also have their hands on or near the levers of political and social power need to come together. That's the burden of what I mean. I bring in the word elite because whenever I make a point like this, people say, "Oh, but that's elitist," and I say, "Well, yeah, there's nothing wrong with being elitist in the right context. We're elitist when we pick the football team. There's nothing wrong with, as it were, identifying horses for courses." And I mean, let's just think what we have to do. What are the necessary controls that have to be put on if there's going to be a hope in hell of saving this situation? We need rationing, administrative rationing, not by price, for fairness of petrol, mobility, power, meat consumption. We need a massive driven shift to renewables. We need community takeover of unproductive land and localisation of economic activity. We need strong financial support for a localised economy. We need a citizen's income so that nobody starves as a result of this transition. Is this going to happen through the existing system or some, as it were, imaginable evolution of it?
Okay.
I think not.
Rupert.
So, when you were imagining these intellectual elites doing what they need to do, John, you said it would be something like a worldwide climate strike for a fortnight. Now, if we imagine that that's a kind of place that would be great to get to try to implement some of these bold changes, well, I put it to you that I'm actually offering some way where you might conceivably end up getting close to that, whereas you're not. You've just done the sort of classic radical flank or eco-Leninist move of sort of saying, let's go and do this really kind of massive, incredibly bold thing. Whereas what I'm saying is what we need to do is to take a lot of people who are just about ready for it on a journey, right? So you've got to take them on a journey. We can't go right there. Rather, what we need to do is to encourage millions to get involved in organisations, in movements. There's nothing wishy-washy or centrist about it, contrary to what Molly said. There's nothing wishy-washy or centrist about being a part of...
Okay, I'm gonna...
You said centrist.
I'm gonna stop you...
Let me just finish the point. Come on.
Okay,
Let me just finish the point. The point is to take people on a journey, and when they get frustrated, then they'll be willing to escalate. The way we might finally get near to doing the bold things that John is talking about, the only possible way I can see is through something like the strategy I outlined.
Okay, I want the question from the man with the beard and the glasses. I know there's a lot of you, but you know who you are.
So, I'm going to give out my position immediately. Be realistic, demand the impossible. If you do give up on 1.5, what's going to happen in 5 years? Are you going to give up on 2? Are you going to give up on 2.5? Because we're heading towards 3.5, almost inevitably as it is. Are you just going to say, be realistic, we're going to live with 3.5, 4, 5?
Okay, that's a good and challenging question. Is there a second part?
At this, it's like this idea that somehow you have to get the majority of civil society on your side, and then we will somehow triumph, is fine if you had 100 years.
Exactly.
When did British civil society become in favour of universal suffrage? Around about 1848. Universal suffrage, 1918. 70 years. 70 years between getting a majority in favour in the population and actually getting the powers to be to... the people who run the world at the moment are the people who should not be running the world.
Okay, this is a powerfully made point, but there are questions in front of you to get through as well, which is we're directly in front of him. Did you have a question? Yeah, that's you. Yeah.
Yes. I just want to say what we're after is a paradigm shift.
Uh-huh.
Just think a bit like that, and you probably need all the strategies that you can lay your hands on.
Very good point. Diagonally in front of you with a grey cardigan. Did you have a point?
Yes. If I was I'm not an academic and I'm not a politician. I'm coming from the business world. I used to qualify as an elite, and I now qualify as an under £15,000 revenue because I changed my life around and recognized my sins. If I was in a business context, I look at your point of views and I remember what the challenge is, which is the speed.
Yeah.
I forget about the 1.5 because we have the scenarios that the IPCC have given us. We have 5 scenarios, so we can just go back to any of them and decide personally which one we feel more confident with, but we have to have one voice and one agreement around the world. But if I was in a business world, I would take your 2 possibilities, answer, solution to go fast, and let's say, why don't we just give it a shot and we test and trial them both? We take a place, we take another place, and then you go and engage in one community, you go with the whole community, and you go and engage with the elites that drives SUVs. Instead of sitting on the fence and looking at solutions, why don't we just test and trial?
We're getting on with it.
It's interesting. Okay.
Sort of bouncing off.
Because these are kind of iterations of the same argument, so I'm not going to rigidly stick to the question-answer format. I'm just going to go to a lot of comments, and that's yours.
Well, if we were to go with John, your sort of technocratic authoritarian revolutionary vanguard to create global change. The current elites will buy their way in. The current elites always find a way to stay an elite. How do you envisage getting a technocratic elite into power that doesn't get overtaken? The only way you can do any sort of substantive change is through a general democratic manner where power is so widely distributed among so many people that it never becomes centralised by those who wish to maintain their status as an elite.
That's a very interesting point. And there's another one, lady with the glasses.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I really liked Rupert's ideas there. I work within, I had a recruitment business and I work in a niche within environmental consultancy. And when trust was first voted in, I was speaking to my clients, I felt so depressed. And I said, what the hell are we going to do here? And so many of them said to me, it doesn't matter, Catherine, that our clients are doing the right thing because they know doing the right thing pays. And I have a habit of working with people that ethically I align with. So yes, I work with the better people in the industry. I won't work with people who work on HST, for example. And there's becoming a really clear divide within that industry of the people that people want to work with and those that they don't want to work with. I think the main challenge in our industry, for example, is the Chartered Institute. SAIM have no real moral compass, and I think there is something to be done in challenging those authorities, those bodies within each industry. So things like the lawyers are responsible, absolutely brilliant. I think those bodies are what we need, and not being climate aware, like smoking is.
Yeah.
They just get pushed further out.
There's a question behind you, that gentleman in the glasses, and then I'll come to you.
Hi, yeah, it's building on that point actually, it's a question to Rupert, because earlier on we talked about polarisation. I mean, do you see any contradiction between what you're suggesting and what Molly was saying about polarisation being directed very much at fossil fuel vested interests, you know, and that small kind of section of society that really dominates and benefits, you know, in terms of power and wealth from that reliance, dependence?
So directly on that, I don't think so. It depends how one does it. I think one of the things that Extinction Rebellion got really right was the no shaming, blaming rule. So I don't think we go around saying people running fossil fuel companies are evil human beings. But sure, of course we can say very, very clearly that there are some roles and entities and so on that are far more responsible than others for the trouble that we're in, and targeting getting rid of those. Kevin talked about major social change. He said, we haven't really tried major social change to stay below 1.5. My proposition to the gentleman at the back is the only way now we really get major social change and dramatic emissions reductions is by levelling with people about how dire the situation is, including about the fact that in realistic terms, 1.5 is just not going to happen. So the point is, it's not about kind of giving up, saying, oh, you know, we're not going to try hard anymore. No, we're going to try even harder on the basis of being truthful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to take this remark in the grey cardigan, and then I think I might allow free chat.
I was just going to make that point actually, which is I didn't hear anybody there saying they've given up on 1.5. I think the truth is it's probably in the rearview mirror, and we should be honest about that.
But my point is that in 5 years' time, 2 will be in the rearview mirror.
Yeah.
Well, if that's the case, then we've got to face it, right? The reason the reasons that we're not making progress is that people are still outsourcing. They still think someone's going to fix this for us.
She didn't have a chance to make her point.
Yeah, but the main point I wanted to make was about somebody once said, you know, we have the power of gods without the wisdom of gods, and if I'm going to go for an elite to run everything, I want to make sure it's the top 1% of wise people, and we don't have that.
This is like Cromwell. Look, in the spirit, I'm not choosing sides, John, but in the spirit of democracy and peanuts, I'm going to allow everybody to just move freely and talk to each other, because I don't think the formality is... Sorry, Jenny. I'm wrapping up when you should be wrapping up.
No, not really. I want to say thank you all for coming.
You've wrapped up. Well done.
Well, that was very good. Thanks for listening, folks.